The moral consciousness cannot forego happiness and leave this element out of its absolute purpose. The purpose, which is expressed as pure duty, essentially implies this individual self-consciousness. Individual conviction and the knowledge of it constitute an absolute element in morality. This element in the objectified purpose, in the fulfilled duty, is the individual consciousness that beholds itself as realized. In other words, it is enjoyment which is thus implied in the notion of morality, not indeed immediately in morality regarded as sentiment or disposition, but only in the notion of its actualization. This, however, means that enjoyment is also implied in morality as disposition, for this does not remain disposition in contrast to action, but proceeds to act or to realize itself. Thus, the purpose expressed as the whole with the consciousness of its moments is that the fulfilled duty is just as much a moral action as a realized individuality, and that nature, the aspect of individuality in contrast to the abstract purpose, is one with this purpose. Necessary as is the experience of the disharmony of the two sides because nature is free, even so what is essential is duty alone, and nature contrasted with it is devoid of a self. That purpose in its entirety, which the harmony of the two constitutes, contains within it actuality itself. It is at the same time the thought of actuality, the harmony of morality and nature, or, since nature comes into account only insofar as consciousness experiences its unity with it, the harmony of morality and happiness is thought of as something that necessarily is. That is, it is postulated. For to say that something is demanded means that something is thought of in the form of being that is not yet actual, a necessity not of the notion qua notion, but of being. But necessity is at the same time essentially relation based on the notion. The being that is demanded then is not the imagined being of a contingent consciousness, but is implied in the notion of morality itself, whose true content is the unity of the pure and the individual consciousness. It is for the latter to see that this unity be for it an actuality. In the content of the purpose, this is happiness, but in its form, its existence in general. The existence thus demanded, that is, the unity of both, is therefore not a wish, nor regarded as purpose, one whose attainment were still uncertain. It is rather a demand of reason, or an immediate certainty and presupposition of reason. Here in paragraph 602, we're seeing this interplay between two sides, both of which are being held together by what Hegel has called the moral consciousness. And the question that we're really asking ourselves here is one that's reversible. I framed it as, what does morality really require from the moral consciousness? What is the demand that morality is making upon the individual person who is aware of their duties? But we can also say, what demand does the individual get to make in return upon morality? Is there anything that the moral consciousness gets to say about the constraints that morality places upon it, or the way in which it evaluates things in the world that are not it? And so what are the two sides that are at stake here? One side is that of duty, and morality very much stresses duty, whether it be a Kantian morality or whether it be any of the other moralities available at the time. Even the hedonistic moralities were quite often framing things in terms of a duty to yourself, to assure yourself of pleasure or something like that, right? So duty is on one side, and then we have this realm of what Hegel, essentially following Kant here, although as we've seen there's more to it than just the Kantian problematic, what he's calling nature, Natur, right? And what's associated with that? Again, this is a very Kantian formulation. Happiness, Glückseligkeit. And we should talk a little bit about this word, because Hegel now is using a term that's similar to, but not exactly the same as what has been called happiness in the translation in the previous paragraphs, that was Glück. This is Glückseligkeit. And you could say this is almost kind of like eudaimonia, right? It refers to a state of the spirit or the soul, and it's using that term Glück, happiness, enjoyment, pleasure, you could even say. It's a state of the soul being, you could say, in good condition. And, it fits this notion of eudaimonism because Kant had criticized any eudaimonistic ethics as essentially following our natural impulses and giving in to nature and removing us from any genuine relationship to morality, to fulfilling our duties for the sake of duty. He saw freedom as lying solely on the side of morality and duty, to be in thrall to our own desires for happiness, whatever we conceive of as happiness, is in fact to be unfree. So all of that is sort of background material. Now let's look at the text. Hegel says, the moral consciousness, now notice what he says here, cannot forego happiness. It cannot leave that behind. You might say, well, why not? I mean, it knows that duty is duty, and it's got nothing to do with happiness. This is the very problematic that Hegel is going to explore. Kant is not the final word, or any similarly deontological ethics. Instead, we have to find some way to incorporate, or at least address, our continual desire for happiness. So he says it cannot forego happiness and leave this element out of its absolute purpose. The moral consciousness is motivated by purpose, by Zweck. And Zweck could be translated as end or goal. So there's a teleological structure here, right, that is being explored within this, not just this passage, but within this entire section. So he says the moral consciousness cannot forego happiness, leave this element out of its absolute purpose. The purpose, which is expressed as pure duty, the purpose is being expressed in that way, in that mode. Is that really the totality of it? He says it essentially implies this individual self-consciousness. Individual self-consciousness, not just general self-consciousness. Every single individual is bound by the same duties, not just generally, but as the individual who he or she happens to be, and they're bound thereby also to forego their happiness, and at the same time they cannot do this. So he says, individual conviction and the knowledge of it constitute an absolute element in morality. That makes sense, right? We're talking about a certain stage in human development. And again, I want to stress the difference between what Hegel here calls morality, or in German, Moralität, and what he calls the ethical, das Sittliche, which was at a previous stage, which could involve the individual, but might also be seen as just what happens to be the case in that community, in that culture, and might be viewed more generally, less individualistically. So he goes on and he says, this element, what's the element? Individual conviction and the knowledge of it. This element in the objectified purpose, in the fulfilled duty, is the individual consciousness, what? That beholds itself as realized. So here's where we have a problematic arising. When I am, in fact, doing my duty, when I am following out what it is, what does morality demand of me, to recognize and to follow out my duty, not for the sake of happiness, but for the sake of that very duty, recognizing it as an absolute value that is binding upon me, just as it is binding upon other people. When I do that and I realize it, I wind up having a certain kind of happiness. I wind up realizing what it is for me to be genuinely moral. And it's not just to have this idea of duty and to try to live up to it. It's to realize it. Here Hegel's going to go back and forth between realization of the individual and realization of the notion, the G.W.F, right? So he goes on and he says, in other words, it is enjoyment. Enjoyment. What does that have to do with duty? What does that have to do with morality? We're going to come back to that. Which is thus implied, he says, in the notion of morality. Enjoyment is implied in the notion of morality. Doesn't that just turn it into what we had just called a kind of eudaimonism? Be a good boy and you get your reward. Or be a good person and virtue will be its own reward because virtue will feel good for you, or something like that. It's not quite going there. But that should be in the back of our mind. So he says it's an enjoyment which is implied in the notion of morality. Now notice what he says next. It's implied not immediately, but in morality regarded as sentiment or disposition, but only in the notion of its actualization. So Hegel is setting aside any sort of sentimentality, any sort of affective relation, say that of sympathy, for example, as a motive for following our duty. That's not what's actually going to be providing us with the enjoyment, nor, as he says, is it a matter of disposition. So a question you could ask yourself here is Hegel rejecting earlier forms of virtue ethics, or at least the ways in which they were being understood at the time? Is he rejecting an ethics of sympathy, as we find developed in, say, Smith or Hume, or later in to some degree in Schopenhauer? Is he rejecting these sorts of things as having anything to do with morality? He's saying those aren't actually going to get you to the notion of morality, because the notion of morality requires that the individual, as he says here, the notion of its actualization, it's being made wirklich, it's being put there in the world. The duty becomes an action, a handeln, or a tat, a deed, right? So he goes on and he says, this means that enjoyment is also implied in morality as disposition. Why? Why can we recuperate disposition at this point? Here again, we see an interesting move in some ways past Kant. People, by the way, often only read the groundwork for the metaphysics of morals, in which Kant, sets out this very stark opposition between duty and happiness, or duty and nature, the free will and nature. And they don't go on to read the actual metaphysics of morals, in which Kant does in fact say that dispositions are quite important to cultivate, in order not as a reliable way of every single time making sure we do our duty, not as something we can go on autopilot with, but as a kind of support for what we need to do. So he goes on and says, it does not remain disposition in contrast to action, but proceeds to act or to realize itself. When we have a disposition that stems from duty, say a disposition towards benevolence or beneficence towards our neighbors, a disposition to truth-telling, one that steers us away from telling lies. When we actualize it, when we are realizing it in some sort of fulfillment, in the kinds of actions that we choose over and over and over again, made easier because we've got that almost inertia, moral inertia, you could say, that has been established by the disposition, then it's no longer just a disposition. This is actually an interesting insight that could in fact apply to many other virtue ethics as well. which are often misread. People say, Aristotle says, well, you just got to establish a habit, and then, you're going to be A-okay. You'll be courageous when you need to be courageous. As if it's just, establishing a stimulus-response loop or some sort of turning the higher faculties off, rather than a way of orienting and supporting them. So, Hegel goes on, and he says, the purpose expressed as the whole with the consciousness of its moments is that the fulfilled duty is just as much a moral action. Now here's a really interesting thing. The fulfilled duty is just as much a moral action as a realized individuality. A fulfilled duty is not just an action. It's not just checking something off. It's me, the person who is doing the duty. I am the one who told the truth. I am the one who gave the fair price. I am the one who assisted the person in need. That becomes me. This is part of the moral perspective on the self. So he goes on and he says, here we go, that nature, the aspect of individuality in contrast to the abstract purpose, the duty, is one with his purpose. Now we get to an important transition point. You notice that we're thinking about whether there's a harmony, and Hegel just uses that, harmony between the German term harmony between nature and morality, or nature and duty, or happiness and duty. So he says, necessary as is the experience of the disharmony of the two sides, because nature is free. What's he referring to? In the earlier paragraphs comprising the beginning of this section, we saw that both morality and nature were free, forms of freedom. So how could there be a relationship between them that isn't, you could say, antagonistic? A harmony or some sort of integration rather than a disharmony. He says, even so, what's essential is duty alone. Nature contrasted with it is devoid of a self. But the purpose in its entirety, which the harmony of the two, he says, constitutes, contains within it actuality itself. Let's repeat that again. The purpose in its entirety, the purpose of moral consciousness, the Zweck, in its entirety, which the harmony of the two constitutes. How can it be an entirety, a whole, a totality? Because there is a harmony available in some respect between these. He says, it's at the same time the thought of actuality. Now notice what he says next. The harmony of morality and nature, or because nature comes into account only as consciousness experiences its unity with it. Now notice what terms he uses next. The harmony of morality and happiness is thought of as something that necessarily is, and now here he says it is postulated. So Hegel is here seemingly following in the footsteps of Kant, who had said something quite similar, but a bit different. For it to be postulated for Kant means that we have to kind of assume it. We have to think it. We have to place, literally postulating is to place out there, even though we don't have evidence for it, and given the fact that we actually not only don't have evidence, we have counter evidence for it. So the harmony of morality and happiness. What would we be talking about there, right? If you're a good boy, you get a nice reward. So what's the nice reward? Well, let's take a sort of religious point of view. Do your duty and you'll go to heaven. Well, there might not be any heaven, and that doesn't really help you much in this world. Okay, do your duty and things will work out for you. Be a nice person and people will be nice to you. No, they might crap on you. They might kick you into the ditch and treat you horribly. You might be stuck within a world of nature that not only has individuals doing mean things to each other, but has all sorts of structural inequities as we talk about them these days. Meaning ways in which things have been, going on for a while that screw some people over and benefit others, including some who don't fulfill their duties, right? Sometimes it's the bastards who seem to enjoy the most happiness. This is a real problematic. And there's, one classic way of dealing with it is, well, they're not really happy, those people who are enjoying power, success, fame, pleasures, getting to do whatever they want, whenever they want to, owning lots of slaves. That's not real happiness. Real happiness is something else. Well, that is true. That's quite correct. But it seems to tear this postulate apart, doesn't it? What about other ways of thinking about it? That's what we're going to get to next. So let's go ahead with this. He says, for to say that something is demanded. Now notice what's doing the demanding at this point, right? Is it morality that's demanding? No, it's the individual conscious demanding something of morality, namely that it be compatible with happiness. To say that something is demanded means that something is thought of in the form of being that is not yet actual, not yet realized. A necessity not of the notion as notion, but just of being. So he says, but necessity is at the same time essentially relation based on the notion. A bit of Hegelian metaphysics here. Being not quite as good as notion. The being that is demanded is not the imagined being of a contingent consciousness, but is implied, he says, in the very notion of morality itself, whose true content is a unity. A unity, or we could say, integration. Of what? A unity, he says, of the pure and individual consciousness. The individual consciousness here being the one who is desiring happiness, the pure consciousness being the realization of duty, realization in the sense of grasping it. Both of these are consciousness that is being brought together now at this point. But this is not yet actual, is it? So he goes on and he says, it's for the latter. Well, who's the latter? The individual consciousness, the individual moral consciousness. It is for the latter to see that this unity be for it an actuality. How does it see that this unity be for it an actuality? Well, at some point, it's going to require making it an actuality, isn't it? Right? It can't just sit there and think it. Otherwise, it's just dreaming. It has to somehow make that be the case. So he says, in the content of the purpose, this is happiness, but in its form is existence in general. Hegel's introducing a new wrinkle there, isn't he? In its content, it's happiness. In its form, existence in general. Its very being, its life. So he says, the existence thus demanded, the unity of both, is therefore not a wish, not something just idle, regarded as purpose, one whose attainment were still uncertain. He says here it's a demand of reason, or an immediate certainty and presupposition of reason. It hasn't said how this is actually going to be accomplished at this point, of course. But it is saying, listen, reason is requiring that in some way all of these things be reconciled with each other. Now, one possibility for this that we already explored in the previous paragraph, enjoyment, fulfillment, were being referenced through here. Enjoyment and fulfillment of what? The enjoyment of actually engaging in moral action, of being able to see oneself as a moral being. The fulfillment of one's very, we don't want to use the word nature here, in part because it's on this side, but the fulfillment of something that is integral to human being in its moral action. That allows say, a higher level of happiness. But this is the two things that have to be said here as we finish up thinking about this paragraph. One is this is not yet realized. And the second thing is it's probably not going to turn out quite so neat as it appears to be for consciousness at this point.